Iran banned drugs, executed thousands, and became the world's most addicted nation. The city of Mashhad wakes up before dawn. The call to prayer moves across rooftops in waves, bouncing off stone walls and satellite dishes, reaching the furthest corners of a city of 4 million people. Mashhad is Iran's second largest city and its holiest. Every year, more than 20 million pilgrims travel here to visit the shrine of Imam Reza, the 8th Imam of Shia Islam, whose golden dome rises above the skyline like something from another world. The faithful come from across the country, across the region, across the globe. They come to pray. They come to be healed. They come, and 2 kilometers from the shrine's outer walls, in a district where the streetlights haven't worked in years, something else is already in motion before the sun has cleared the horizon. The men arrive in 1s and 2s. Some crouch against walls. Others stand in loose clusters, hands buried in jackets despite the season. Transactions happen without eye contact. A folded bill passed palm to palm, a small parcel returned in the same motion. There are no raised voices, no running. The whole thing operates with the quiet efficiency of a place that has been doing exactly this, in exactly this way, for a very long time. By 6 in the morning, before most of the city has made tea, hundreds of people have already passed through. This is not a back alley anomaly. This is not an exception. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. This is Tuesday in Mashhad, and Wednesday, and every morning of every week of every year, in this city and in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Tabriz, in Avaz, in villages along the Afghan border where the road turns to gravel and the nearest hospital is 4 hours away. The scale of what is happening in Iran with opioids is not a crisis in the way a flood is a crisis, something that arrives, devastates, and eventually recedes. It is structural. It has been building for over a century, and by almost every available measure, it is the worst opioid situation on the planet. Here is the number that stops most people. Iran has an estimated 2.8 million registered drug addicts. That is the official figure, the one the government acknowledges, the one that appears in UN reports and health ministry statements. But Iranian researchers who study this from inside the country put the real number between 4 and 6 million. In a country of 88 million people, that means somewhere between 1 in every 22 and 1 in every 15 Iranians is dependent on an illegal substance, not experimenting, not occasionally using, dependent physiologically, chemically, daily. To put that in proportion, the United States, a country with more than 3 times Iran's population, and a country in the middle of its own opioid catastrophe that has consumed a decade of headlines, congressional hearings, and billions of dollars. The United States has approximately 2 million people with opioid use disorder. Iran has more. Iran, with a third of the population, has more. But the raw numbers are only the beginning of the strangeness. Iran is an Islamic republic. Alcohol is banned. A man can be flogged for possessing a bottle of wine. The state has executed, publicly by hanging, more than 10,000 people for drug offences since the revolution of 1979. 10,000 executions. That is not a statistic from a single bad year. That is a sustained, decades-long campaign of the most extreme legal punishment a state can administer, applied specifically and repeatedly to the drug trade. And across those same decades, in the years between each wave of executions, the number of addicts in Iran went up. Every decade, without exception, the number went up. The executions happened on cranes in city squares. Photographs circulated. The message was not subtle, and still the market expanded, the supply held, and the number of people standing in pre-dawn streets waiting for a transaction kept growing. There is something in Mashhad that captures the specific quality of this contradiction better than any statistic. The Imam Reza Shrine Complex is one of the largest religious structures on earth, a labyrinth of courtyards, libraries, museums, and prayer halls covering more than 600,000 square meters. Its central dome is covered in gold. At night, it is floodlit, and the light it throws across the surrounding neighborhoods is warm and constant, like a second sun that never sets. Pilgrims who have traveled for days to reach it stand in the courtyards and weep. 2 kilometers away, in streets that same light does not reach, Iran's holiest city runs one of the country's most active open-air drug markets. The proximity is not ironic. It is not coincidental. It is the entire story compressed into geography. Opium is the primary substance. Raw opium, smoked or dissolved and drunk as tea. The same substance that has moved through this land for 200 years. But alongside it now, heroin, refined from the same Afghan poppies. Crystal methamphetamine, locally called shishe, glass, because of what it looks like, and, some would say, because of what it does to the mind. The market in Mashhad does not specialize. It serves what the city needs, and the city needs a great deal. Iran shares a 936-kilometer border with Afghanistan. Afghanistan grows approximately 80% of the world's opium. Between those two facts, the border and the crop, there is a corridor through which more narcotics flow than through any comparable stretch of land on Earth. Iran is the first stop. It has been the first stop for decades. The drugs come across the border on foot, on motorcycles, in the hollow compartments of trucks and the lining of suitcases. Iranian border forces seize tonnage every year that would fill warehouses. What they seize is, by every expert estimate, a fraction of what passes through. Some of it continues west, toward Turkey, toward Europe, toward the insatiable markets that lie beyond. But some of it stays, more of it, every year, stays. The question of how a country arrives at this, not just as a transit point but as the most saturated consumer market on earth, a country where the official state ideology prohibits intoxication on religious grounds and enforces that prohibition with the death penalty, is not a simple question. It does not have a single answer. It has a geography, a history, a political economy. It has decisions made by men in offices whose names never appeared on any court document. It has a culture older than the Islamic Republic by many centuries, in which the poppy was not contraband but harvest. And it has individual lives, millions of them. People who did not intend to end up where they ended up, moving through a system that was never designed to help them, and may have been designed, in ways that took decades to become visible, to ensure a different outcome entirely. The golden dome of the shrine catches the first light of morning. Below it, the market has not moved. It will not move. It has never moved. And the question of why, the real why, underneath the statistics and the executions and the geography, is what the rest of this story is about. But to understand how Iran arrived at this morning, in this city, with these numbers, it is necessary to go back much further than 1979, further than the revolution, further than the first execution, further even than the first attempt at a ban. It is necessary to go back to the moment when the poppy was not a problem at all, when it was simply a plant, and the people who grew it had never heard the word addiction, because the word did not yet exist. The poppy has grown in Iranian soil for at least 3,000 years. Not secretly, not at the margins. In the open, in fields that stretch to the horizon in the provinces of Fars, Kerman and Khorasan, tended by farmers who measured their wealth in the weight of the resin scraped from the seed heads each summer. The plant had a name in Persian, kashkash, and that name carried none of the freight it carries now. It was agricultural vocabulary, the same category as wheat. For most of recorded Iranian history, opium occupied the same cultural space that wine occupies in Mediterranean Europe, a substance used medicinally, socially and ceremonially, woven into the fabric of daily life without being considered a vice. Persian physicians prescribed it for pain, for dysentery, for the fevers that killed children in summer. Poets referenced it. Travellers noted it. A 16th century Safavid court physician described the proper dosage for a grown man as casually as a modern doctor might recommend an aspirin, 1 mithqal dissolved in rosewater taken after the evening meal. The critical detail is this: nobody was hiding anything. Opium in Qajar-era Iran, roughly 1789 to 1925, was a taxed, regulated, state-sanctioned commodity. The government didn't just tolerate its cultivation, it depended on it. Opium taxes funded court expenses, military salaries, and the increasingly desperate debts that Qajar Shahs accumulated as they tried to modernize a crumbling empire. By the mid-19th century, opium represented somewhere between 15 and 20% of Iran's total export revenue. Remove the poppy, and the Qajar state's finances collapse. Then the British arrived, not to fix this, to expand it. The East India Company had already built an opium economy across South Asia, growing the drug in Bengal, shipping it to China, and using the profit to fund the entire apparatus of British colonial administration in India. The system required supply chains, and Iranian opium fit neatly into them. British commercial agents moved through southern Iran, signing contracts with local landowners, connecting Iranian producers to global markets they had never previously accessed. The poppy fields of Fars province were suddenly feeding demand in Shanghai and Calcutta, and London's own expanding underclass. Iranian production tripled between 1850 and 1900. The land that had grown food began growing opium instead, because opium paid better. Farmers who had never thought of themselves as part of a global economy were now nodes in the largest drug trade the world had ever seen. None of them used the word drug. They used the word crop. Meanwhile, inside Iran, consumption was rising alongside production. More supply meant lower prices. Lower prices meant wider access. Opium that had once been a luxury of the court and the merchant class was now affordable to labourers, to soldiers, to the poorest households in provincial towns. The method of use shifted too. From eating or drinking, it dissolved in liquid the traditional forms to smoking, which delivered the substance to the brain faster and made the habit far harder to break. By 1900, some estimates placed the number of regular opium users in Iran at over 1 million people in a population of roughly 10 million, 1 in 10. And still, in the vocabulary of the era, there was no word for what had happened to them. The concept of addiction as a medical condition, as something that happened to the brain and body rather than to the moral character, barely existed anywhere in the world at this point. European physicians were still debating whether habitual opium use was a disease or a weakness. In Iran, the question wasn't even being asked. A man who used opium daily was not considered sick. He was considered a man who used opium daily. The same way a man who drank tea daily was considered a man who drank tea daily. This is not ignorance. This is a different framework of understanding, operating without the information that would later make the stakes visible. The first attempt to change anything came not from inside Iran, but from international pressure. The 1912 International Opium Convention, signed at The Hague, called on producing nations to restrict cultivation and export. Iran signed, then continued producing at roughly the same rate, because the economic dependency on opium revenue had by that point become so deep that restricting it without replacing that income would have destabilized the state. Reza Shah Pahlavi, who took power in 1925 and founded the Pahlavi dynasty, made the first serious domestic attempt at restriction. He had a modernizing agenda. He wanted Iran to look, to Western eyes, like a nation capable of governing itself rather than a chaotic remnant of a decayed empire. Opium cultivation was an embarrassment on the international stage. Between 1928 and 1955, a series of increasingly strict laws moved Iran toward a formal ban. But here is where the first crack in the logic appears. Restricting supply does not automatically reduce demand. By 1955, when Iran formally banned domestic opium production, there were an estimated 1.3 million regular users in a population of roughly 19 million. These people did not stop using because a law was passed. They found other sources, and the most convenient other source was across the eastern border, Afghanistan, where no such ban existed, where the poppy fields stretched across provinces the size of European countries. The ban worked in a narrow technical sense. Iranian cultivation dropped. The fields of Fairs and Kerman were planted with other crops. Government inspectors could point to falling domestic production figures and call it a success. What the figures didn't show was what was coming across the border. What they couldn't show, because no one was measuring it yet, was that Iran had just made itself dependent on imported narcotics instead of domestic ones, had traded a supply chain it could theoretically control for one that answered to no Iranian law, no Iranian court, no Iranian government. The fields went quiet, the use did not. And in the households where opium had been present for generations, where grandfathers had smoked it after dinner, where it had been offered to guests the way tea was offered to guests, where its presence was so unremarkable that children grew up with the smell of it as background. In those households, the 1955 ban changed almost nothing immediately visible. The substance still arrived. The ritual continued. The only difference was that now it arrived from somewhere else, through channels that were already beginning to develop their own logic, their own economics, their own power structures. Nobody in those households in 1955 understood what was being built in the space between the failed ban and the eastern border. It would take another quarter century before the full shape of it became clear, and by the time it did, a revolution would have arrived and promised to solve everything, and instead lit the fuse on something far larger than the Kaja poppy fields had ever been. The question hanging over 1955, over the quiet fields and the unchanged habits, was not whether the drug would keep coming. It would. The question was who would control it, and what they would do with that control. On February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off an Air France jet at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran and into a crowd of several million people. He had been in exile for 15 years. He returned to a country that had just dismantled its monarchy in 18 days of street protests, and he returned with a blueprint, not just for a new government, but for a new kind of state, one in which Islamic law would govern everything from banking to dress codes to what a man was permitted to put into his body. On drugs, Khomeini was explicit from the beginning. Intoxication was haram, forbidden. The poppy was incompatible with the republic he intended to build. Within months of taking power, the new government announced penalties for drug trafficking that went beyond anything the Pahlavi dynasty had attempted. Possession of more than 5 kilograms of opium, or more than 30 grams of heroin, carried a mandatory death sentence, not a guideline, a mandate. The first executions for drug offences happened in 1980. Public hangings, carried out on construction cranes because Iran didn't have enough permanent gallows to meet demand. The bodies left on display for hours, photographs distributed in newspapers as a statement of intent. The Islamic Republic was not making a policy. It was making a declaration about what kind of country this would be. And for a brief moment it appeared to work. Domestic opium cultivation, already reduced since the 1955 ban, dropped further under revolutionary pressure. Users who had smoked openly in tea houses now did so behind closed doors. Street markets that had operated in daylight moved to basements and back rooms. The surface of the country changed. The behaviour retreated inward, became less visible, easier for officials to point away from. Then, on December 24, 1979, 10 months after Khomeini's return, Soviet tanks crossed into Afghanistan. What followed in Afghanistan over the next decade would reshape the entire region's relationship with narcotics in ways that no Iranian decree could counteract. The Soviet-Afghan War created a catastrophe in slow motion. Millions of refugees flooding westward into Iran and Pakistan, agricultural land abandoned or destroyed, and a resistance movement, the Mujahideen, that needed money, weapons, and organizational structure, and found all three by taxing and protecting poppy cultivation in the territories it controlled. Afghan opium production in 1979 stood at around 200 metric tons. By 1989, when the Soviets finally withdrew, it had risen to over 800 metric tons annually. The infrastructure of global heroin supply, the processing labs, the smuggling networks, the financial systems for moving drug money across borders, had been built, refined, and hardened across an entire decade of war. All of it pointed west, and west meant Iran. The 936-kilometre border between Iran and Afghanistan is not a wall. It is not even, across most of its length, a fence. It is a line drawn through some of the most remote and difficult terrain in Asia. Desert plateaus, mountain passes, river valleys that flood in spring and crack apart in summer. The Islamic Republic stationed border guards. It built outposts. It confiscated shipments and announced the seizures in state media as evidence of vigilance. In 1980, Iranian authorities seized approximately 150 metric tons of opium and its derivatives at the border. In 1985, the figure was over 300 metric tons. By 1989, it exceeded 500 metric tons annually. Each successive year, the quantity seized was larger than the year before, and each successive year, officials framed this as evidence that the crackdown was intensifying. What those numbers actually described was something different. If seizures were doubling, and the price of opium on Iranian streets was simultaneously falling, which it was consistently throughout the 1980s, then the amount getting through was not decreasing. It was increasing faster than the seizures were. The border was a colander, and Iran kept measuring how much it was catching, not how much was passing through the holes. By 1985, the price of a gram of opium in Tehran had dropped to roughly a third of its 1979 price. Adjusted for the inflation the revolutionary economy was generating, it was even cheaper relative to wages. The Islamic Republic was executing traffickers and seizing record quantities at the border, and the drug was simultaneously becoming more affordable and more widely available to ordinary Iranians. Something in the system was not adding up. But there was a second force operating alongside the economic one, slower and less visible, that the execution statistics could not address at all. The 1980s in Iran were not only defined by the revolution, they were defined by 8 years of war with Iraq, a grinding, catastrophic conflict that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Iranians, shattered a generation of young men, and produced a country in which trauma was not an individual experience, but a national condition. Veterans returned from the front with injuries, with memories that didn't respond to any available treatment, with bodies that had been pushed past their limits in trenches and under artillery. Iranian psychiatry in 1985 had no framework for what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. It had no infrastructure for treating it, even if it did. Opium treated it. Not perfectly, not safely, but it quieted the memories, softened the pain, made sleep possible when sleep had become impossible. Across veteran communities in Tehran, in Isfahan, in the provincial cities that had sent the most men to the front, opium use spread through social networks the way any coping mechanism spreads. Quietly, without announcement, passed between men who trusted each other because they had survived the same things. This was not what the government's anti-drug messaging was designed to reach. The propaganda depicted drug users as morally compromised, as enemies of the Republic, as the kind of person who belonged on a crane. It had no vocabulary for the veteran who used opium to sleep, who had a wife and children and a job and a habit that those around him understood because many of them shared it. The 1980s ended with Iran in a condition that its own officials were only beginning to measure and were not yet ready to describe publicly. The war with Iraq had concluded in 1988, a ceasefire that Khomeini described as drinking poison. The Reconstruction era began. Cities were being rebuilt. The economy was slowly stabilizing after years of wartime disruption. And somewhere in the health ministry, a statistician was looking at figures that didn't appear in any public report. Hospitalization records, mortality data, provincial health surveys that had been conducted quietly, without press coverage, because the people who commissioned them already suspected what they would find and needed to know the number before they decided what to do with it. The number was 1.2 million. That was the estimate for regular opium users in Iran as of the early 1990s, more than double the figure from before the revolution, achieved despite a decade of executions, border seizures, and the most aggressive anti-drug legal apparatus in the country's history. The statistician compiled the report. It was marked for restricted distribution. It moved up through the ministry. It reached people with the authority to release it publicly, to begin a national conversation, to call the thing by its name. They read it, they set it down, and they made a decision about what to do next that would not become fully visible for another 20 years, but whose consequences were already accumulating day by day in the households and tea houses and veterans' apartments of a country that had declared war on the poppy and was quietly, steadily losing. Isfahan, 1993. The city sits at an elevation of 1,590 meters above sea level in the center of the Iranian plateau, and in autumn the air carries a particular quality. Thin and dry and faintly cold even at midday, the kind of air that makes everything feel slightly more vivid than it should. The bridges over the Zayanda River are full on Thursday evenings. Families spread plastic tablecloths on the grass beneath the arches. Someone always brings a thermos of tea. Dariush Mohammadi was 22 years old and in his final year of civil engineering at Isfahan University of Technology. He was not the kind of student who struggled. His notebooks were dense with calculations, margins filled with small geometric sketches that had nothing to do with the coursework, force diagrams turned into abstract shapes, load distributions that became, if you tilted the page, something almost like art. He had a specific future in mind, infrastructure, bridges specifically. The kind of work that left something standing after you were gone. The wedding was his cousin's, held in a garden in the Olfa district, the old Armenian quarter of Isfahan, where the houses have wooden balconies and the walls are painted the particular faded blue that only appears in places that have been the same colour for 100 years. There were perhaps 80 people. The food was excessive in the way wedding food always is. Rice with saffron and barberries, lamb that had been cooking since morning, bread still warm from a neighbourhood bakery. Dariush sat near the older men after the meal, the way young men do at Iranian weddings when they want to be taken seriously. his uncle, a man in his late 50s, a contractor who had built half the apartment blocks in the neighbourhood, and who carried himself with the specific gravity of someone who has never once doubted a decision, produced a small pipe from his jacket pocket. The pipe was old. The brass fittings had been worn smooth by years of handling. He prepared it with the unhurried movements of a ritual so familiar it required no thought, the way an experienced cook salts a pot without measuring. It moved around the circle. It reached Dariush. Nobody presented it as a choice. It arrived, the way food arrives at a table, the assumption being that of course you will take it, because this is what is happening here, and declining would require an explanation that the moment didn't call for. The word teriac, opium, was never spoken. It didn't need to be. Everyone at that table already knew. What happened next is not dramatic. That is the important thing to understand. There was no thunderclap, no immediate revelation. A warmth that began in the chest and spread outward, reaching the hands and the backs of the knees and the space behind the eyes. A sense that whatever had been slightly wrong, the low-grade anxiety of final exams, the background noise of a young man's unresolved ambitions, had simply been turned down, the way you turn down a radio in another room. The world did not become better. It became quieter. Dariush went home that night and slept without dreaming. To understand why what happened next was possible, it is necessary to understand what opium actually does inside the human body, not in moralistic terms, but in mechanical ones. The brain contains a system of receptors called opioid receptors, distributed across regions that govern pain, emotion, reward, and the automatic functions that keep a person alive. These receptors exist because the body produces its own opioid-like chemicals, endorphins, enkephalins, that bind to them during exercise, during physical stress, during moments of intense pleasure or connection. The system is ancient, present in every mammal, a fundamental part of how the brain regulates suffering and reward. Opium contains compounds, morphine, codeine, and dozens of related molecules, that bind to these same receptors with far greater force than anything the body produces naturally. When they arrive, the receptors respond as though the body is experiencing the most profound relief it has ever known. Pain signals travelling toward the brain are intercepted. The emotional centres quiet. The stress response shuts off like a switch being thrown. The first time the brain experiences this as an event, extraordinary, unfamiliar, something it files away with unusual intensity. The second time, it is already looking for it. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw encoded into certain people. This is the opioid receptor system operating precisely as designed, responding to an external compound that fits its architecture more perfectly than anything it evolved to expect. The brain does not know the difference between the endorphin released by a long run and the morphine metabolized from a pipe of opium. It only knows that something bound to the receptor, and the receptor responded, and now the receptor wants that again. Dariush used again 3 weeks later at a smaller gathering. A few of his uncle's friends, a Thursday evening with no particular occasion. He told himself this was social. He was right. In Iran's cultural context, particularly among men of his uncle's generation and social circle, opium use existed in an entirely different category from what the government's anti-drug campaigns depicted. It was not etiadat, addiction, with its connotations of degradation and moral failure. It was tariac, with its connotations of tradition, hospitality, and the specific dignity of men sitting together after a long week. The distinction lived in the language, and the language shaped what was visible and what wasn't. He graduated in the spring of 1994, found work almost immediately with an engineering firm in Isfahan, mid-sized, reputable, the kind of company that had survived the revolutionary disruptions and the war economy and emerged with enough government contracts to keep 30 engineers employed steadily. He was assigned to infrastructure assessment, examining bridges, road overpasses, the aging concrete structures that the country's construction boom of the 1970s had left behind and that now needed evaluation before they collapsed. He was good at it. The work required patience and precision, the ability to look at something damaged and understand not just what was broken, but how the break had progressed, what small failure had led to the next, what the structure had endured before the first visible crack appeared. Dariush had an instinct for this that his colleagues recognized and that his supervisors began to rely on. He used opium on weekends, occasionally on a Thursday, which in Iran functions as a Friday, the edge of the weekend, the exhale after the working week. The amounts were small, the intervals were regular. Everything in his visible life was proceeding according to a reasonable plan. His mother noticed nothing. His colleagues noticed nothing. His university friends, scattered now across different cities and different careers, noticed nothing because they rarely saw him, and when they did, he was the same Dariush, quieter than some, more contained, the one who listened more than he spoke. What none of them could see was what was happening at the level of the receptor, because here is what the brain does when an external compound repeatedly binds to its opioid receptors. It adjusts. The receptors become less sensitive, a process called down-regulation, the body's attempt to maintain equilibrium against a flood of artificial stimulation. The natural endorphin system, no longer needed, begins to produce less. The baseline shifts. The state that Dariush had experienced at his cousin's wedding, that ordinary evening with the cold autumn air and the thermos of tea, begins to require the pipe to reach. Without it, the world does not return to neutral. It drops below neutral, below the new baseline, into a low-grade discomfort that is not dramatic enough to name but persistent enough to notice, every morning as the first conscious thought of the day. By late 1995, Dariush was using during the week. Not every day, not yet. 3 times a week, then 4, the intervals shrinking so gradually that each individual step was invisible against the backdrop of everything else in his life that was continuing normally. He told his mother his stomach had been bothering him. She suggested he eat more yogurt. He was 24 years old, employed, physically healthy by any outward measure, carrying a habit that had no name in the household he had grown up in, because in that household, in that culture, in that city in 1995, it was not yet a problem. It was a thing men did. It had always been a thing men did. The Iranian health ministry had numbers that said otherwise, locked in a report that very few people had read. Those numbers were about to become impossible to keep quiet, and the reason had nothing to do with opium. The report landed on the desk of Iran's health ministry in 1995 with a figure that should have ended the silence immediately. 1.2 million regular opium users, conservatively estimated, across a country whose official position was that its anti-drug campaign was succeeding. The document was 43 pages. It included provincial breakdowns, demographic distributions, and a methodology section that made clear this was not a rough guess. It was the product of 2 years of careful survey work conducted through hospital networks, rural health posts, and the kind of door-to-door interviewing that requires a great deal of trust to produce honest answers. The people who received it read it carefully, then they classified it. Not destroyed, classified. Restricted distribution. The distinction matters. Destruction would have been an act of panic. Classification was something more deliberate, a decision that the information existed, that it would be preserved, but that the public would not have it. The reasoning, reconstructed later from policy documents, and the testimony of health officials who eventually spoke about this period, was not complicated. If the government acknowledged 1.2 million addicts, it faced an immediate political demand to do something about 1.2 million addicts. And the only tools it had, the tools the Republic had spent 15 years building, were criminal ones. Arrest, prosecution, execution for trafficking, prison for use. Arresting 1 million people was not a policy. It was a collapse. So the report sat. Isfahan kept its Thursday evenings. Tehran kept its basement markets. The border kept its traffic. And inside the prison system, something was beginning that would eventually make the classified report irrelevant, not because the addiction figures changed, but because a new number appeared that was impossible to classify away: HIV. The virus that had been moving through intravenous drug-using populations in Europe and America since the early 1980s arrived in Iran's prisons in the early 1990s through shared needles, and by 1995 the infection rate among incarcerated drug users was accelerating at a rate that prison health officials could not manage quietly. The prisons were overcrowded. Iran had been filling them with drug offenders for 15 years under the mandatory sentencing laws, and overcrowded prisons with shared needles and no prevention infrastructure are among the most efficient environments for HIV transmission that exist. The first official acknowledgement came in 1996. Iran had an HIV problem among its prison population. Not a crisis. Officially, a problem. Manageable. Being addressed. The acknowledgement was technically accurate and practically misleading, in the way that official acknowledgements of this kind often are. What was happening in Iranian prisons by the mid-1990s was not a problem being addressed. It was a transmission event in progress, with new infections accumulating faster than the system could count them, let alone treat them. Meanwhile, Dariush's mornings had acquired a new texture. He was waking earlier than he needed to, not because of ambition or anxiety, but because sleep had become shallow, fragmentary. The last 2 hours before dawn spent in a half-conscious state that felt less like rest and more like waiting. His body had developed an opinion about timing. It knew at a cellular level approximately when the previous dose was wearing off, and it registered that knowledge as a low insistence. Not pain exactly, not yet, but a background discomfort that made lying still feel worse than getting up. He began keeping a small supply in the drawer of his bedside table, not a large amount, just enough to not have to think about sourcing it before work. His engineering firm had assigned him to a long-term project assessing highway bridges in the corridor between Isfahan and Yazd, a stretch of road through flat, ochre-coloured desert, where the infrastructure was aging faster than the maintenance budget allowed. He drove the route twice a week, stopping at each structure, spending 2 to 4 hours per bridge with measuring equipment and a camera, documenting what he found. It was solitary work which suited him. The desert light was extraordinary in winter, flat and white and total, making every crack in the concrete surface visible in a way that softer light would have obscured. He was still good at his job. The cracks in the concrete were easy to read. The cracks in other things were not. Back in Tehran, a specific bureaucratic argument was unfolding that would define the next decade of Iranian drug policy. On one side, the security establishment and the judiciary, who argued that the answer to the HIV crisis in prisons was stricter enforcement. Fewer needles by ensuring fewer drug users, achieved through longer sentences and more executions. On the other side, a small isolated faction within the health ministry, backed by a handful of Iranian epidemiologists who had been studying the prison data, who argued that the needle was the vector and the needle had to be addressed directly, regardless of what the law said about the substance in the syringe. The second group was proposing something that, in the context of the Islamic Republic's official position on drugs, was nearly incoherent. Give addicts clean needles. Acknowledge through the act of provision that addiction was a health condition rather than a criminal choice, and that preventing the spread of a lethal virus mattered more than the ideological consistency of the state's anti-drug position. This argument did not win immediately. It would take years. And while it was being argued in ministry conference rooms, something was happening at the border that was about to make every existing policy framework obsolete. In 1996, the Taliban took control of Kabul. By 1998, they controlled roughly 90% of Afghan territory. Their relationship with opium was, in those early years, ambiguous in a way that would later become significant. They taxed it. They permitted it in areas where banning it would have cost them political support, and the fields kept producing. Afghan output in 1999 reached 4,600 metric tons, the highest ever recorded to that point, a number that dwarfed anything the pre-Soviet Afghan agricultural system had produced. Iranian seizure figures for the same year: 1,700 metric tons, the highest the country had ever confiscated, presented publicly as evidence of a functioning border operation. The price of opium in Tehran that year fell to its lowest point in 2 decades. Then the Taliban did something unexpected. In July 2000, Mullah Omar issued a decree banning poppy cultivation as Islamic. The ban was enforced with unusual completeness. Satellite imagery showed Afghan poppy fields going dark across province after province. The 2001 harvest was less than 200 metric tons, a 96% reduction in a single year. Global opium markets convulsed. Prices spiked. The supply chain that had been feeding Iran for 2 decades suddenly contracted. For approximately 9 months, Iranian drug enforcement officials experienced something they had not seen in a generation: visible scarcity on the street market. Prices doubled, then tripled. Users who couldn't afford the new prices sought out substitutes: prescription opioids, industrial solvents, combinations of substances that were far more dangerous than straight opium. Then September 11th happened. The United States invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban collapsed. And within 1 growing season, the fields were back. Not just back. Expanded. The chaos of the post-invasion period, the competing warlords, the absence of functioning central government in the opium-producing provinces, all of it created conditions in which poppy cultivation was the most reliable source of income available to Afghan farmers, and no authority existed with both the will and the capacity to stop it. By 2004, Afghan production had reached 4,200 metric tons. By 2007, it exceeded 8,000 metric tons, double the pre-ban record, more than the rest of the world's illicit opium production combined. The 936-kilometre border received it all. Iranian seizure figures kept climbing. Street prices kept falling. The 1995 classified reports figure of 1.2 million users was, by the mid-2000s, so far behind the actual situation that officials within the health ministry had stopped referencing it even in internal documents. A new survey, conducted in 2002 and not classified this time, because by then concealment had become operationally impossible, put the figure at 2 million users. 2 million in a population of 65 million, despite everything. Dariush was 31. He had been using daily for 4 years. His hands were steady at the bridge site, still precise with the measuring equipment, still reliable in the reports he filed. But his supervisor had begun noting, in a private log he kept for performance reviews, that Dariush arrived to morning meetings with a faint sheen of perspiration regardless of the temperature, and that his eyes, always calm, had acquired a quality that was harder to name, a flatness, as though the distance between his face and whatever he was looking at had grown slightly longer than it used to be. The supervisor had not yet said anything directly. He was waiting to see if whatever it was would resolve on its own. It would not resolve on its own. The question was only how long it would take for that to become undeniable, and what the country around Dariush would look like by the time it did. The year 2000 arrived in Iran without the fanfare it generated elsewhere. No millennium celebrations. The Iranian calendar runs on a different count, and the year 2000 in the Western calendar was simply the middle of the Iranian year 1378, unremarkable numerically. But something shifted in that period nonetheless, something that had nothing to do with calendars and everything to do with chemistry. Shisha appeared. Crystal methamphetamine had existed in other parts of the world for decades, but its arrival in Iran in the late 1990s and early 2000s introduced a substance that operated on an entirely different axis from opium. Opium slowed things down, quieted the nervous system, suppressed pain, made the world manageable. Shisha did the opposite. It flooded the brain with dopamine in quantities that the reward system had never encountered, producing a state of intense alertness, confidence, and euphoria that could last 12 hours, and that left, when it ended, a crash so total that the only rational response the depleted brain could generate was to use again immediately. The demographics split cleanly. Opium's primary users were older, men over 30, often functioning, embedded in the cultural tradition that had normalized the substance across generations. Shisha found the young, university students in Tehran managing exam pressure, factory workers in Avaz pulling double shifts, young men in provincial cities where unemployment had been above 30% for a decade, and where the future, examined honestly, offered very little to anticipate. The pipe passed between different hands now. Iran's drug landscape in 2003 looked nothing like it had in 1993. What had been a single substance problem layered over a century of cultural normalization had become a multi-substance crisis cutting across every demographic, every income level, every age group. The Health Ministry's 2002 survey figure of 2 million users was already outdated by the time it was published. Field researchers working in Tehran's southern districts, the poorest quarters of a city of 12 million, were reporting concentrations of use that the national average couldn't capture. In certain neighborhoods, social workers estimated that 1 in 4 households contained at least one person with a serious substance dependency. 1 in 4, not nationally, block by block, building by building, in the places where the economy had already failed before the drugs arrived. Dariush knew none of these statistics. He was living inside them. His wife, Zara, had noticed the bedside drawer. She'd said nothing for 3 months, not because she didn't understand what she'd found, but because naming it would require a conversation that would restructure everything, and she was not yet ready for that restructuring. She worked as an administrator at Isfahan's main hospital. She saw every day what the far end of this road looked like. She also knew her husband was not there yet, and the distance between where he was and where those patients were seemed, from inside their apartment, large enough to be meaningful. She was measuring the wrong distance. Dariush lost his job in the spring of 2004. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no discovered impairment, no single incident that forced the issue. His supervisor's private log had accumulated 18 months of small observations, tardiness that was always explainable individually, but formed a pattern when laid end to end. 2 reports submitted with calculation errors that Dariush himself caught and corrected before anyone else noticed. But catching your own errors requires noticing them, and the noticing had become slower. A bridge assessment in the Yazd corridor that should have taken 3 hours and took 7, with no clear account of where the time went. The engineering firm was restructuring anyway. Government contracts had thinned since the nuclear program began generating international friction, and the company used the restructuring to quietly eliminate positions it had been looking for reasons to eliminate. Dariush's was among them. He received a letter, a final payment, and a handshake from the HR manager who couldn't quite meet his eyes. He told Zara the contract work had simply ended. She asked about the next contract. He said he was looking. He was not looking. 3,000 kilometers away, in Brussels and Washington, a different conversation about Iran was accelerating. The nuclear negotiations that had been simmering since 2002 were collapsing in increments. The European Union and the United States were moving toward a coordinated sanctions regime that would, over the following decade, target Iran's banking system, its oil exports, its access to international financial infrastructure, the circulatory system of a modern economy, systematically restricted until the pressure became unbearable. The first significant sanctions waves hit in 2006 and 2007. Their effects were not immediate, but they were cumulative, and by 2010 the Iranian rial had lost more than half its value against the dollar. Inflation ran above 30% annually. The cost of imported goods, medicines, industrial components, food staples, rose faster than wages in every sector. Unemployment, already elevated, climbed further as businesses that depended on international trade contracted or collapsed. And opium got cheaper. Relative to wages, relative to food, relative to the cost of managing ordinary existence in an economy in free fall, opium became more affordable as everything else became less so. This is not a paradox. It is a supply chain reality. Afghan production was at record highs. The border was porous. The trafficking networks were mature and efficient. There were no sanctions on the drug trade because the drug trade operated entirely outside the formal economy that sanctions could reach. A day's supply of opium in 2012 cost less, in real terms adjusted for inflation, than it had in 1990. A kilogram of chicken in Tehran cost more than 3 times its 2005 price. The economics of despair had their own arithmetic. The new users of this period did not fit the cultural template of the uncle at the wedding, the veteran managing old pain, the professional with a discreet habit. They were younger, they were poorer, they were using in stairwells and under bridges rather than in private rooms, and they were mixing substances in combinations that dramatically increased overdose risk. Opium and shisha together, or opium and whatever prescription opioid could be sourced from pharmacies, where oversight had weakened as the broader system strained. Iran's health ministry, by this point, had abandoned the fiction of a contained problem. In 2010, the government took a step that would have been unthinkable in 1990. It formally decriminalized addiction. Users caught with substances below certain thresholds would no longer face criminal prosecution. They would be directed toward treatment. The execution policy for trafficking remained unchanged, but the addict on the street had been reclassified, at least legally, from criminal to patient. This was a genuine policy shift. It was also a decade late and structurally incomplete. The treatment infrastructure that would have made decriminalization meaningful, enough clinics, enough trained counselors, enough methadone to manage withdrawal for millions of people across a geographically enormous country, did not exist at the scale required. What existed was a network of state-run detox facilities that could handle, at capacity, a fraction of the population that needed them. The waiting lists in Isfahan alone ran to several months. In rural Sistan-Baluchistan province, the southeastern region that shares the longest stretch of the Afghan border, there were districts with no treatment facility of any kind within 100 kilometers. The policy said, addicts are patients. The infrastructure said, most patients cannot be seen. Dariush entered the treatment system for the first time in 2006, 2 years after losing his job. Zara had found, in a coat pocket, a sum of cash that made no sense against any household expense she could account for, and this discovery could not be filed away the way the drawer had been. The conversation that she delayed for 3 years happened finally in the kitchen at 11 at night and by morning Dariush had agreed to a 30-day residential detox program at a facility on the eastern edge of Isfahan. He completed the 30 days. He came home thin and quiet, moving through the apartment with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning how rooms worked. Nasrin was 8 years old. She'd been told her father was sick with something like the flu, something that required special treatment, and she had accepted this because 8-year-olds accept what they're told when the adults telling them seem to believe it. Dariush stayed clean for 4 months and 11 days. The return happened so incrementally that Zara almost missed it. Almost. But the hospital where she worked had given her an education in the specific signs of early relapse that no amount of hoping made invisible. The sleep disruption first. Then the small cash withdrawals resumed, too small individually to confront directly, too regular to dismiss. The flat quality behind his eyes that his supervisor had noted years earlier, returning like weather. By 2008, he was using daily again. The amounts were larger now than before the detox. This is physiologically consistent. A body that has been cleared of a substance and then reintroduced to it, often establishing a new, higher baseline, as though making up for lost time. His weight dropped to a level that his mother during a family visit noticed and commented on, attributing it to the stress of unemployment and the economy and the general difficulty of the era, which gave everyone sufficient reasons to look unwell. Zara filed for divorce in 2009. Not in anger. The anger had been present and then had exhausted itself over 5 years, leaving something more like a technical assessment of a structure that could no longer bear the load placed on it. She took Nasrin. She left Dariush the apartment, which he could not afford on no income, and which he sublet the second bedroom of to a young man from Yazd who asked no questions and paid cash. Nasrin was 13. The last thing she saw of her father on the day they left was him standing in the doorway of the apartment in a grey undershirt, one hand on the doorframe, watching them carry boxes to her aunt's car. He did not help with the boxes. His hand on the doorframe was the only thing keeping him at the correct angle to the floor. She would not see him again for 17 years. Across Iran, in that same period, the treatment system was doing something that no one had predicted and that would eventually be cited in the international health publications as a model worth studying, though what exactly the model had achieved was more complicated than the citation suggested. The needle exchange programs, finally approved after years of internal argument, had gone to scale. Methadone maintenance clinics were operating in every major city. HIV transmission among intravenous drug users, which had been accelerating through the prison system in the late 1990s, was measurably slowing. By 2015, Iran had over 5,000 drug treatment centres, more per capita than most European countries. HIV infection rates among drug users had fallen by more than 50% from their peak. The World Health Organization referenced Iran's harm reduction program in reports about innovative public health responses in difficult political environments. The reports were accurate. They were also incomplete. What none of them addressed was the total number of people dependent on opioids in Iran in 2015. That number was not falling. It was not stable. It had risen steadily through every year of the harm reduction program's operation, from 2 million in 2002 to estimates ranging between 3 and 4 million by 2015. The program had succeeded at what it was designed to do: reduce disease transmission among existing users. It had not reduced the number of users. It had not been designed to do that, because designing a program to do that would have required addressing the supply, the poverty, the cultural normalization, the border, and the structural forces keeping all of those things in place. Nobody in the international health community asked too directly about those structural forces. The question of who was actually keeping the supply chain operational, who benefited from its continuity, who had ensured for decades that the largest trafficking networks operated without serious disruption, That question had answers. But the answers lived in a different category of document than public health reports. They lived in the space between what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officially did and what it actually controlled. And that space, in 2015, was about to become visible in ways that the Republic had spent 30 years ensuring it would not. In the autumn of 2015, an Iranian investigative journalist named Kayvan Shirazi published a series of articles in a reformist Tehran newspaper that lasted exactly 4 editions before the publication was shuttered by the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance. The articles were not particularly explosive by international standards. They contained no photographs, no named sources, no documents that could be independently verified in a court. What they contained was a pattern, a sequence of documented facts placed in proximity to each other that created an image the reader assembled without being told what they were looking at. The pattern was this: Iran's largest drug trafficking networks, the organizations responsible for moving not kilograms, but metric tons of opioids across the Afghan border and distributing them through provincial wholesale systems into every major Iranian city, had been operating continuously for over 20 years without a single senior figure being arrested, prosecuted, or executed. The executions that fill the state's public record, the thousands of hangings that the Republic pointed to as evidence of its drug war, were almost exclusively of low-level carriers, mules, addicts caught with personal supply, small-time street dealers from poor neighborhoods who had no connection to the organizational infrastructure above them. Shirazi had cross-referenced execution records with trafficking seizure data and found an absence so consistent it could not be accidental. The bigger the shipment seized, the less likely any associated arrest would result in prosecution of someone above the courier level. Networks that had been identified by name in UN drug enforcement reports in the 1990s were still operating under the same organizational structures 2 decades later. The names at the top had not changed. The addresses of the warehouses used for staging had not changed. The routes had not changed. Shirazi was detained 3 days after the 4th article published. He was held for 11 days without charge and released. He never published on the subject again. The articles were gone. The pattern they described was not. To understand what Shirazi had found, and what multiple subsequent investigations by journalists at Reuters, the BBC Persian Service, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime reached toward without ever quite being able to fully document, it is necessary to understand the structure of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known by its Persian acronym, the IRGC. The IRGC is not simply a military organization. It is the dominant economic force in Iran, controlling an estimated 30 to 40% of the national economy through a network of ostensibly civilian companies, construction conglomerates, import-export operations, and financial institutions that operate outside normal regulatory oversight. It controls ports, it controls border crossings, it controls the inspection infrastructure at the specific entry points through which the vast majority of Iran's trade, legal and otherwise, moves. When a shipment crosses the Afghan border into Iran's Sistan-Baluchistan province, it passes through terrain that the IRGC's border forces patrol. When it reaches a major city, it moves through logistics infrastructure that IRGC-affiliated companies control. When the money generated by its sale needs to be cleaned and moved, it passes through financial channels that operate outside the banking system the international sanctions regime was designed to constrain. This does not mean the IRGC as an institution sanction the drug trade. The documented evidence does not support that conclusion, and the distinction matters. What the evidence supports, in UN reports, in leaked communications reviewed by European intelligence services, in the financial forensics conducted by the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control is something more granular and harder to prosecute, that specific commanders, specific units, and specific affiliated networks within the IRGC's vast apparatus had established protection arrangements with major trafficking organizations. Not policy, not orders from the top, individual arrangements, generating individual revenue streams, operating in the institutional space that a powerful and unaccountable organization inevitably creates. The difference between an institution that runs the drug trade and an institution within which individuals run the drug trade is legally significant. Practically, for the supply chain on the ground, it produces identical results. Here is the consequence that nobody in the international community discussed publicly. The Western anti-narcotics funding that flowed into Iran through the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime from the early 2000s onward, European money, primarily aimed at strengthening Iranian border interdiction capacity, did not stop the drug trade. It did something more specific. It improved the capacity of Iranian security forces to identify, intercept and eliminate small and medium-sized trafficking operations that had no institutional protection. The large operations, the ones with connections to IRGC-affiliated networks, were not touched by the improved interdiction capacity. They were, if anything, advantaged by it. Every small competitor that the newly equipped border forces eliminated was market share that consolidated upward into the organizations that the new equipment could not reach. The European Union funded the elimination of competition for the networks it was trying to stop, not intentionally. The road to this outcome was paved entirely with genuine counter-narcotics intent, carefully documented program goals, and rigorous reporting frameworks. The outcome arrived anyway, because the program's designers understood the border as a geography problem and not as a political economy problem, and those are different problems with different solutions. The seizure figures kept climbing. The price on the street kept falling. The same arithmetic as always. But now the arithmetic had an explanation. There was a specific year when the shape of this became undeniable within the specialist community of people who studied Iranian drug trafficking professionally. The year was 2013. A UN monitoring report produced for internal circulation among member states and later partially leaked noted that despite record seizures at the Iranian border, wholesale opium prices in Tehran and Isfahan had reached their lowest point in 30 years. The report's authors, constrained by diplomatic language, described this as indicating supply chain resilience and adaptive trafficking networks. What those phrases described, translated out of bureaucratic caution, was a system that could absorb any level of border interdiction and continue delivering product, because the interdiction itself was selective. The leaked documents circulated among European counter-narcotics officials generated internal discussions and produced no public statement from any government. The diplomatic relationship with Iran, already complicated by the nuclear negotiations that were approaching their conclusion, did not have room for an accusation of this magnitude without evidence that could survive a legal challenge. The evidence that could survive a legal challenge did not exist in public accessible form. It existed in the operational records of the IRGC, which no outside investigator had ever accessed, and which the IRGC had no incentive to produce. So the funding continued, the training programs continued, the seizure announcements continued, and the supply continued, because the supply had never actually been the target of the people who controlled it. In Isfahan, Darish Mohammadi knew none of this, and would not have found it useful if he had. By 2015, the question of where his supply came from was not something he thought about. He was 44 years old, living in the sublet apartment where the young man from Yazd had long since been replaced by a succession of other young men whose names he rarely learned. He had not worked in 11 years. His mother sent money when she could. She was 71 and lived on a pension that the inflation of the sanctions era had reduced to something close to symbolic. Dariush's daily expenditure on opium exceeded his monthly income from his mother's transfers. The gap was covered by methods he'd developed over years of managing it, selling household items, small borrowings from acquaintances who expected no repayment, occasional day labour at a construction site 4 blocks away where the foreman asked no questions about the men he hired for cash at 6 in the morning. The foreman had his own reasons for asking no questions. The site was the kind of place where nobody's condition was remarkable, because everybody's condition was compromised. Dariush's hands were still steady when he needed them to be. This surprised even him. He could carry things, move things, follow instructions, perform physical tasks with the focused competence that his brain, even in this state, retained as a kind of muscular memory from the years of precise professional work. For 4 or 5 hours in the morning, after the first use of the day had resolved the previous night's withdrawal, he was functional in a narrow but reliable way. By afternoon, the window had closed. His daughter Nasreen was 22 in 2015. She'd grown up in her aunt's apartment in the Shahpur district of Isfahan, had studied nursing at Isfahan's Al-Zahra University, and was in her first year of clinical rotations at the same hospital where her mother had worked. She had her father's habit of filling margins, not with geometric sketches but with small written notes to herself, observations about patients, questions to follow up on, the accumulated detail work of a mind trained to notice what wasn't immediately obvious. She had not seen her father since she was 13. She knew he was alive because her mother received occasionally a message through a mutual acquaintance, not from Dariush directly, because Dariush did not have a working phone most of the time, but from people who had seen him recently and knew the connection existed. The messages were always the same in their essential content. He was alive, he was in Isfahan, he was the same. Nasreen processed these messages the way she processed difficult clinical information, by filing them in the appropriate category and continuing with the work in front of her. The work in front of her was the only part of this she could affect. She was 3 years away from the moment when that would change. But before it did, something was going to happen in Afghanistan that would alter the entire equation. Not just for Dariush, not just for Iran, but for the global opium supply in a way that nobody in any ministry or any UN office had modelled for because nobody had thought it was possible. The Taliban was coming back, and this time their relationship with the poppy would not be ambiguous. On August 15th, 2021, the last American military helicopters lifted off from the roof of the US Embassy compound in Kabul. By evening, Taliban fighters were sitting in the presidential palace, photographing themselves behind the desk where Ashraf Ghani had been sitting that morning. The 20-year American project in Afghanistan ended in the span of a single afternoon, with a speed that surprised even the Taliban. Within weeks, the new Taliban administration began making announcements about governance, schools, courts, the role of women in public life. And in April 2022, 8 months after taking Kabul, Taliban Supreme Leader Haibatullah Akhundzada issued a decree that the international community had not expected and did not know how to process. A total ban on poppy cultivation, effective immediately, enforceable by destruction of standing crops and imprisonment of farmers who refused to comply. The world's drug enforcement agencies looked at the decree with practiced skepticism. The Taliban had issued a similar ban in 2000. It had held for 1 season before collapsing. The assumption in most Western intelligence assessments was that this ban would follow the same arc, a gesture toward international legitimacy, abandoned within 18 months when the economic pressure on Taliban-controlled territory became unsustainable. The ban held. Satellite imagery analysed by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime showed Afghan poppy cultivation falling by 95% between the 2022 and 2023 growing seasons. Fields that had been continuous green across Helmand, Kandahar and Nangarhar provinces, the agricultural engine of the global heroin supply for 2 decades, went to bare earth. The processing labs went dark. The convoys that had moved product westward toward the Iranian border reduced to a fraction of their previous volume. Global opium markets convulsed in a way they had not since 2001. Wholesale prices in European markets tripled within 6 months. Street heroin in cities from London to Berlin was cut to levels that made overdose from unexpected purity spikes a serious and documented risk. The opposite of the usual overdose mechanism, where users die from products stronger than expected, but now from the reverse, where the supply had been so diluted during the shortage that returning purity caught users off guard. The entire downstream ecosystem of global opioid supply was shaking from a single agricultural decision made in Kandahar. Iran should have been the country most affected. For 40 years it had been the first stop on the route from Afghan fields to European markets. Its addiction crisis was built on Afghan supply. When Afghan supply vanished, the assumption was that Iranian street prices would spike, availability would collapse, and millions of dependent users would be thrown into crisis-level withdrawal simultaneously. That assumption was wrong. And the reason it was wrong revealed something about Iran that changed the entire frame of everything that had come before. The price of opium in Tehran rose in late 2022, modestly, for approximately 4 months. Then it stabilized. Then, in the spring of 2023, it began falling again. The supply had not collapsed, it had shifted. Iran's southeastern provinces, Sistan, Baluchistan and Kerman, the territories that share the longest stretch of the Afghan border, and that have historically been Iran's poorest and most ungoverned regions, had been quietly developing domestic poppy cultivation infrastructure for years. Not at the scale of Afghan production, not visibly, but consistently, in the high valleys and remote agricultural zones where central government oversight was thinnest, and where the economic incentive for a farmer to plant poppies rather than wheat was, by the 2000s, overwhelming. When the Afghan supply contracted, this domestic production did not merely fill the gap. It expanded to meet the opportunity. UN monitoring reports from 2023 estimated Iranian domestic opium production at levels that would have been inconceivable a decade earlier. Figures that placed Iran not just as a transit country, experiencing supply disruption, but as an emerging producer capable of sustaining a significant fraction of its own demand independently of Afghan imports. Iran had crossed a line. It was no longer a conduit. It was a source. The implications took time to fully register even among specialists. A transit country can theoretically be addressed through border interdiction, through upstream pressure on the producing country, through diplomatic engagement with the supplier. A country that produces its own supply has internalized the problem in a way that border measures cannot reach. The fields are inside the border. The supply chain begins on Iranian soil. The farmers growing the crop are Iranian citizens in provinces where the central government has always struggled to extend meaningful authority. This was the moment everything converged. The 40-year arc from the 1979 revolution's war on drugs to a country producing its own. The seizures that never reduce street prices, the executions that never reduce supply, the harm reduction programs that saved lives without reducing dependency, the protection arrangements that kept major networks intact across 3 decades, the border that was simultaneously Iran's vulnerability and its economic infrastructure. All of it had been moving toward this. Dariush Mohammadi was 51 years old in the spring of 2022. He had been through the detox system 8 times since 2006, a figure his case file at the Isfahan Treatment Centre recorded with clinical neutrality, each entry dated, each discharge noted, each relapse implied by the next admission date. 8 cycles through a system that had been internationally praised for its accessibility and its harm reduction approach. 8 times clean, for periods ranging from 3 weeks to 7 months. 8 returns. His 9th admission came in February 2022, referred by a social worker attached to a mobile health unit that operated in the southern Isfahan neighbourhoods where Dariush had been living for the past 4 years. The mobile unit's staff had encountered him during a routine outreach visit, seated against a wall in the courtyard of a partially demolished building that had been scheduled for renovation since 2018 and had instead become informal shelter for 8 or 10 men in approximately his situation. The social worker's intake notes described a man who was coherent, cooperative, and aware of his circumstances with a clarity that she found both encouraging and difficult to account for given his physical state. His weight was 58 kilograms. He was 178 centimeters tall. He answered her questions in full sentences and asked, before she left, whether the detox facility in the Eastern District was still operating under its previous director, whose name he knew and whose approach he preferred. He had preferences. After 9 admissions, he had developed opinions about the quality of different facilities, the way a traveller develops opinions about hotels. The facility was full. Dariush was placed on a waiting list and given a referral card for outpatient methadone dispensing at a clinic 12 kilometres away. He attended the clinic for 11 consecutive days, walking both directions because he had no money for bus fare, arriving each morning with the particular punctuality of a man who has very little to organise his day around except this one appointment. On the 12th day, the clinic's methadone supply ran short. A dispensing error 3 days earlier had accelerated through the inventory. The pharmacist apologised and told him to return in 4 days. He did not return in 4 days. He returned to the courtyard. When his transfer to the residential facility finally came through 6 weeks later, the waiting list had moved. The intake nurse noted that he had lost another 3 kilograms since the social worker's initial assessment. She also noted that he asked, before being shown to his room, whether there was a window that faced east. He liked the morning light, he said. It helped him wake up properly. His daughter Nasreen was 30 years old and working night shifts in the cardiac unit of a hospital in Isfahan's northern district, a different hospital from the one where her mother had worked, where she'd done her clinical rotations, where she'd first understood what the far end of her father's road looked like. She had moved to the northern district 3 years earlier, partly for the position and partly for the distance it put between her daily route and the southern neighbourhoods where she knew, from the occasional message through the acquaintance network, that he was. She was good at her work in the specific way that people are good at things they have been preparing for, without knowing it, since childhood. The cardiac unit required patients with chronic conditions, diseases that didn't resolve cleanly, patients who returned repeatedly, situations where the best available outcome was stabilization rather than cure. She'd been training for this cognitive framework since she was 8 years old, and her mother had first tried to explain, in age-appropriate language, why her father wasn't coming home. The paperwork that would change everything arrived at her station on a Tuesday night, 3 hours into a shift, in the form of a referral request from the detox facility in the Eastern District. A patient, her father's name, his date of birth, his identification number, all matching, was being assessed for transfer to a higher care facility and had listed her as next of kin. The form required a family member's acknowledgement signature. Nasreen read the form twice. She set it face down on the desk. She finished the tasks immediately in front of her. A medication check, a patient observation round, a call to the night physician about an unrelated case. Then she picked the form back up, turned it over, and signed it. She did not yet know what she would do beyond that. The signature was not a decision about the future. It was an acknowledgement that the future had arrived regardless. Meanwhile, across Iran, the numbers that no official report had captured cleanly were accumulating in a form that could no longer be managed through careful framing. The unofficial overdose mortality estimates compiled by Iranian public health researchers and cross-referenced with mortality registry data suggested a figure that the health ministry had not published and would not publish. Somewhere between 100 and 130 people dying from drug-related causes every single day in Iran. Not per year, per day. At the lower estimate, that was 36,500 deaths annually. More than 100 times the number killed in road accidents. More than the total mortality from most of the diseases that received dedicated national health campaigns and ministry task forces. A number that, if it appeared in any other context, if it described deaths from a pathogen, from an industrial accident, from a military conflict, would constitute a national emergency demanding immediate, total, restructuring response. It described the drug crisis. It appeared in academic papers and internal health ministry assessments. It did not appear in state media. It did not generate a national emergency declaration. The golden dome of the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad still caught the morning light. Below it, the market had not moved. The men who arrived before dawn were arriving in slightly larger numbers than the year before, for a substance that was now, in a proportion that was growing monthly, grown not across the border in a foreign country's collapsed fields, but in Iranian soil, by Iranian farmers, moving through Iranian networks toward Iranian users. The Republic had spent 43 years fighting a war against the poppy. The poppy had come home. And in a room in a detox facility in eastern Isfahan, Darish Mohammadi was lying on a narrow bed facing the window he'd requested, the one that faced east, waiting for morning light that would confirm, at least for another day, that he was still in a position to see it. His transfer papers were signed. He did not know yet by whom. The transfer came through on a Wednesday in March 2022. The facility Nasreen's signature had unlocked was a longer-term residential program, 90 days rather than 30, with structured counselling, occupational therapy, and a methadone maintenance component that was calibrated individually rather than dispensed at a standard dose regardless of body weight and history. It was one of 14 such facilities in Isfahan province. It had a waiting list of 4 months. Dariush had bypassed that list because a family member had signed the acknowledgement form, which moved a case from the administrative category of socially isolated to the category of family-supported, and family-supported cases received prioritised placement under a 2018 policy revision that almost nobody outside the system knew existed. A signature on a form. 4 months erased. Nasreen visited on a Sunday, 5 weeks into his stay. She drove herself, arriving at 11 in the morning with a bag containing 2 things: a container of rice and herb stew that she had cooked the previous evening, and nothing else. She considered bringing other things, books, practical items, something that would give her hands something to manage during the visit, and had decided against all of them. She carried the food and nothing else. Dariush was in the facility's courtyard when she arrived, sitting on a low concrete bench near a fig tree that had not yet leafed out for spring. He was thinner than the photograph she'd constructed in her imagination from 17 years of second-hand information, and at the same time more present, more recognisably himself, more continuous with the man she remembered from before 13 than she had allowed herself to expect. His hands, resting on his knees, were still. They sat in the courtyard for 2 hours. He asked about her work with the specific curiosity of a man who had spent years with nothing to be curious about and was relearning the motion. She described the cardiac unit, the night shifts, the particular logic of treating conditions that didn't resolve. He listened without interrupting, which he had not remembered him doing, and realized this was not a memory gap. He had learned it here, in the weeks of structured counseling where listening was the primary activity. He did not ask about Zara. He did not ask about himself. When the visit ended and she stood to leave, he remained seated, watching her cross the courtyard, and the stillness of the fig tree behind him and the stillness of his hands on his knees formed a single image that she would not be able to describe to anyone afterward, but would not forget. The 90 days completed in June. He was discharged with 3 things: a month's supply of methadone in sealed daily packets, a referral card for outpatient continuation at a clinic in the Shahpur district, and a document listing community support resources. A single printed page, the font small enough to fit everything onto one side. The Shahpur clinic was 40 kilometers from the neighborhood where he would be living. In a city where bus routes ran irregularly, and Dariush had no vehicle and no consistent income to pay for taxis, 40 kilometers was not a distance. It was a decision that had to be made actively every single day, to make the journey or not, to maintain the continuity of treatment or allow the gap to open, knowing from 9 previous cycles exactly what happened when gaps opened. This is what Iran's harm reduction system looked like at the level of one person navigating it. 5,000 treatment centres, internationally praised, genuinely operational, and a 40-kilometre gap between a discharged patient and his nearest continuation clinic, in a city of 2 million people with a drug crisis that had been building for 40 years. The global health community's assessment of Iran's program was not wrong. It was measuring the right things badly. HIV transmission among intravenous drug users in Iran had fallen by more than 80% from its peak, a genuine, documented, significant public health achievement that represented real lives not lost to a preventable disease. The needle exchange infrastructure, the prison-based health programs, the methadone availability in locations that had none 20 years earlier. These were not theatre, they were functional. But the metric that mattered most to the 4 to 6 million Iranians living inside the crisis, whether the number of dependent users was falling, that metric had never moved in the right direction. Not in any year of the harm reduction program's operation. Not once. The program had been designed to reduce the harm experienced by existing users. The question of why there kept being more existing users every year, that question pointed at the border, the poverty, the supply chain, the cultural infrastructure, the economic forces that made the drug cheaper than managing ordinary life. And none of those things were addressable within a health ministry's program parameters. Internationally, the praise continued. Domestically, the numbers continued rising. In 2023, the Iranian Parliament's Research Centre, a body that produces policy analysis for legislators and that occasionally publishes findings the executive branch would prefer remained internal, released a report estimating the total cost of Iran's drug crisis to the national economy, lost productivity, healthcare expenditure, law enforcement costs, incarceration, premature mortality. The figure was 150 trillion rials annually, approximately $600 million at the heavily distorted official exchange rate, and multiples of that at market rates. A country already under severe economic strain from sanctions was absorbing, in addition, the full weight of the most intensive opioid crisis on earth. The parliamentary report made a specific observation that no previous official document had stated so plainly. The cost of the crisis was increasing every year, and the increase was accelerating. Not stable, not plateauing, accelerating. 2 months after the report's publication, its lead author was summoned to a meeting with officials from the Ministry of Intelligence. The meeting's content was not disclosed. The author made no further public statements about drug policy. Meanwhile, In the southeastern province of Sistan-Baluchistan, the territory that shares the most porous stretch of the Afghan border, the province where 48% of the population lives below the official poverty line, where the unemployment rate among men under 30 exceeds 50%, and where the central government's physical presence thins to near invisibility in the rural districts, the poppy fields were expanding. Iranian agricultural satellite monitoring, cross-referenced with UN remote sensing data, showed cultivation in the province increasing by an estimated 35% between 2022 and 2024. The farmers growing the crop were not ideologically motivated traffickers. They were agricultural labourers in a region where the alternatives to poppy cultivation were subsistence farming in soil conditions that made yields unreliable, seasonal construction work in cities they couldn't afford to live in, or the specific poverty of waiting for government assistance that arrived irregularly and covered a decreasing fraction of actual costs. A poppy field paid. Nothing else paid as reliably. The calculation was not complicated. The trafficking networks that moved the harvested opium northward and westward into Iran's major cities were the same networks that had moved Afghan product for decades. Same routes, same staging areas, same organizational structures. They had simply moved their sourcing upstream, from foreign fields to domestic ones, with the efficiency of organizations that had spent 30 years optimizing a supply chain and needed only to adjust one variable. The IRGC-affiliated protection arrangements that had operated for Afghan transit product adapted without visible disruption. The product was now Iranian. The arrangements continued. In Kerman province, the other southeastern region where cultivation was expanding, a provincial agricultural official submitted a report to the central government in late 2023 documenting poppy cultivation in 14 districts that had previously grown pistachios and dates. The report requested guidance on enforcement policy. The guidance that returned 6 weeks later directed the official to coordinate with security forces on a case-by-case basis. No systematic eradication program was announced. No targeted agricultural support to incentivize alternative crops was funded at the scale the report had requested. The fields continued. What had changed, genuinely and permanently, was Iran's relationship to the global supply chain. For a century, Iran had been the land through which the drug passed. It had been the corridor, essential, exploited, damaged by the traffic moving through it. That role had carried its own particular kind of harm, the leakage into domestic consumption, the corruption of border institutions, the slow saturation of a country that had never intended to be a market. Now it was also a source. The corridor had become a producer. The distinction was not semantic. A transit country can, theoretically, be addressed from the outside, through pressure on the producing country, through border technology, through international agreements with the transit government. A country producing its own supply has absorbed the problem into its agricultural economy, its provincial power structures, its land use patterns. It is no longer a pipe through which the crisis flows, it is the reservoir. Dariush made the journey to the Shahpur clinic on the day of his discharge, and for 31 consecutive days following it. He walked the first 4 times, 2 hours each direction across a city that was, in the dry heat of an Isfahan summer, not comfortable to cross on foot. On the 5th day, a social worker attached to the clinic arranged a subsidized transport card that covered 3/4 of the bus fare, and the daily journey shrank to 90 minutes each way. On day 32, he did not appear. The clinic's outreach worker sent a message through the acquaintance network that connected to Nasrin's knowledge of where he lived. Nasrin received it on a Thursday morning after a night shift. She sat with her phone for 7 minutes, not paralyzed but still, in the way she was still in difficult moments, processing rather than reacting. Then she drove to the southern district. She found him in the apartment, not in the courtyard, not using, sitting at the table in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at the far wall, in the particular state that the clinic's counsellors had described to her as the decision window, the period after a near relapse when the choice was still genuinely available, when the person was still present enough to be reached. She sat across from him. She did not speak immediately. After a while she refilled the tea. He went back to the clinic the next day. Day 33. The streak restarted. What happened in the weeks and months that followed is not a story of recovery in the clean sense, the arc from crisis to resolution that a different kind of story would deliver here. It was smaller than that, more contingent, more dependent on logistics and transport cards and the particular chemistry of a 90-minute conversation in a kitchen over cold tea. The clinic, the social worker, Nasrin's proximity, the transport card. Remove any one of those variables and the outcome changes. They happen to align, for now. Iran's parliament was debating in the same period a revision to the anti-narcotics law that would reduce the mandatory death penalty threshold for trafficking. Not eliminate it, reduce it, shifting some categories of offence from capital punishment to life imprisonment. Human rights organisations had been pressing for this change for years. The pressure had come, in the end, not primarily from humanitarian arguments, but from a judicial efficiency argument. The courts were processing more drug cases than they could manage, the execution apparatus was strained, and the deterrent effect, measurable in every available supply and pricing metric, was zero. The reform passed in 2021 and took effect gradually. The number of executions for drug offences fell from over 250 in 2020 to under 100 in 2023. Not zero. Under 100. The supply did not change. Somewhere in the southeastern corner of the country, in a valley in Sistan Baluchistan, where the road from the nearest town turns to packed dirt and then to no road at all, a farmer was making a calculation about what to plant in the spring. He had planted wheat for 20 years. The wheat price, adjusted for the cost of water and seed and the unpredictability of the rains, had not covered his family's expenses in any of those 20 years. His eldest son had left for Tehran 3 years ago and sent money when he could, which was not often. The man planting the field had not thought about the Golden Dome in Mashhad. He had not thought about Dariush in the kitchen, or the transport card, or the classified report from 1995, or the executions, or the European funding that had trained the border forces, or the protection arrangements, or the UN reports. He had thought about his field, his family, and what the ground would bear. He planted poppies, Mashhad, pre-dawn. The call to prayer moves across rooftops the same way it always has, in waves, building from the shrine's loudspeakers outward through the city, reaching the neighbourhoods where the streetlights haven't worked in years before the sound fully fades. The market is already in motion. The first time this street appeared in this story, it looked like an anomaly, something that existed in spite of everything surrounding it, a dark exception to a holy city's identity. It looked like a failure of enforcement, a gap in the system, something that better policing or stricter law or more international pressure might eventually close. It looked, from the outside, like a problem that had a solution which simply hadn't been applied yet. Now the viewer sees it differently. The men arriving before dawn are arriving at the end of a supply chain that runs backward through Isfahan's southern districts, through Kerman's expanding poppy valleys, through Sistan Baluchistan's ungoverned agricultural land, through the protection arrangements that have operated without interruption for 30 years, through the border infrastructure that seized record tonnage every year while prices fell, through the classified report that sat in a drawer in 1995 while the number it described doubled and then doubled again, through the Khwaja fields that fed British commercial routes in the 19th century, through 3,000 years of Iranian soil that grew the poppy before anyone had a name for what the poppy did to the people who used it. The man making the transaction in the pre-dawn shadow of the world's largest mosque is not standing at the edge of Iranian society. He's standing at its centre, at the convergence point of everything the country has been unable to resolve about geography, economics, culture, institutional corruption, and the specific cruelty of a system that executes the poor for participating in a trade that the powerful have managed for profit. The Golden Dome catches the first light. Below it, the transaction completes. The market has not moved. Here is what the Islamic Republic of Iran has done since 1979 in the name of ending this. Executed more than 10,000 people for drug offences, a number larger than the total population of many Iranian provincial towns, a number that required decades of systematic effort to accumulate, cranes and ropes and courts processing cases by the thousands. It has seized, over the same period, hundreds of thousands of metric tons of narcotics at its borders, quantities that would fill sports stadiums, that represent genuine operational effort by border forces who have died in significant numbers in armed confrontations with trafficking convoys. It has built 5,000 treatment centres, launched the harm reduction program that international health bodies praised and studied and cited as a model. It has decriminalised addiction, reformed its mandatory sentencing, trained thousands of counsellors, dispensed millions of doses of methadone to people who would otherwise have had nothing. And across every year of every decade in which all of this happened, the number of people dependent on opioids in Iran increased. Not fluctuated, not plateaued, increased. Every decade, without a single exception, since the revolution that promised to make Iran drug-free arrived in 1979. The question that this forces, the question that the executions and the seizures and the praised programs and the parliamentary reports and the classified documents all circle without answering, is not whether Iran tried. It tried. The question is what it is possible to try when the geography doesn't change, when the poverty doesn't change, when the institutional arrangements that protect the supply chain don't change, when the cultural normalization embedded across 3,000 years of agricultural history doesn't change, and when the state's own apparatus contains the people who benefit from the continuity of everything the state claims to be fighting. In Isfahan, on a Thursday morning in the late spring of 2023, Dariush Mohammadi rode a bus across the city to a clinic he'd been attending for the better part of a year. He was 52 years old. He carried a small bag containing his identification documents and a thermos of tea. The thermos his daughter had left at the apartment after a visit the previous week, the same dark green colour as the door of the house in Yolfa, where his cousin's wedding had been held 30 years earlier, though he had not made that connection consciously, and would not have known what to do with it if he had. He sat in the waiting area with 6 other people, and waited for his name to be called. The walls of the clinic were painted the particular institutional yellow that paint manufacturers sell specifically to government facilities, a colour designed to be neither aggressive nor calming, achieving instead a quality of pure neutrality that after long enough becomes its own kind of pressure. Dariush had sat in rooms this colour many times. He had stopped seeing the colour years ago. His name was called. He went in. The appointment lasted 22 minutes. His methadone dose was reviewed, his blood pressure taken, his sleep quality assessed through a standard questionnaire he had completed so many times that he could anticipate each question before it appeared on the clinic worker's screen. Everything was stable. The worker made a note. Dariush was given his next appointment card 2 weeks out and walked back through the yellow waiting room into the morning. The bus home took 40 minutes. He sat near the window. Outside, Isfahan moved at its ordinary Thursday pace. The bazaar was open, the traffic dense near the bridges, the Zayande River running low this year because the drought that had been reducing it incrementally for a decade had continued reducing it. The riverbed visible in stretches where water had been continuous since the Safavid era. The city was managing its contradictions the way it always had, simultaneously ancient and modern, religious and pragmatic, publicly ordered and privately complicated, the gap between official reality and lived reality maintained by the same collective agreement that maintains such gaps everywhere. Dariush got off at his stop and walked the 4 blocks to his building. On the staircase he passed his neighbour from the 3rd floor, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the building since before Dariush moved in, who knew approximately what Dariush's situation was and had never mentioned it, who nodded as they passed in the way neighbours nod when they have reached the specific understanding that acknowledgement is sufficient and words are not required. In his kitchen, the appointment card went on the table. 2 weeks out, a fixed point in the near future, concrete and reachable. The referral card from his discharge 9 months earlier, the one printed on a single page in small font listing community resources, was still on the same table. He had never thrown it away. It had moved from one surface to another as he cleaned, had been covered by other papers and uncovered again, but it had not been thrown away. Now consider what is happening simultaneously in the same country on the same Thursday morning. In Sistan Baluchistan, a field that was wheat 3 years ago is poppy today. The harvest will come in 6 weeks. The farmer's eldest son, who came back from Tehran when the money stopped, will help with the scoring of the seed heads, the delicate, skilled work of cutting just deep enough to release the resin without damaging the plant, learned from watching rather than from instruction, the same technique that Iranian farmers used in the Qajar fields 150 years ago, unchanged because the plant has not changed, and the resin has not changed, and the market for what the resin becomes has not changed. In a border district of Kerman province, a truck that carries dried fruit commercially, and has carried dried fruit commercially for 11 years, is completing a return journey from a depot near Zahedin. The driver has made this route 400 times. Customs officials at the checkpoint wave him through on the basis of 11 years of unremarkable passage and a manifest that matches the cargo, mostly. The portion that does not match the manifest is in a compartment that was installed by a mechanic in Zahedin, whose work has been used on this route without incident for 6 years. In Tehran, a wholesale transaction is completing in a warehouse district in the south of the city. The transaction involves weight in the hundreds of kilograms. The men involved know each other. They have been working together since 2004. None of them has ever been arrested. 2 of their competitors, smaller operations that work the same routes without the same institutional relationships, were seized in coordinated border operations in 2019. The seizures announced publicly, the tonnage figures cited in the state's annual anti-narcotics report as evidence of intensified enforcement. In Mashhad, the market from this story's first paragraph is transitioning from its pre-dawn peak to its morning steady state. The crowd thins slightly, not because it ends, but because the initial rush of people who need to complete their purchase before work or before the day's first obligations pull them elsewhere has cleared. Those who remain are the ones with nowhere in particular to be. The shrine's gold dome is fully lit now. The morning prayers have concluded. The pilgrims who came to be healed are moving through the courtyards, and here is the final number. Not the largest number in this story, not the 10,000 executions, not the 4 to 6 million addicts, not the 150 trillion reals in annual economic damage. The final number is smaller, and because of that, harder to absorb than the large ones. Since this story began, since the first words of the first paragraph describing this pre-dawn street, approximately 3 Iranians have died from drug-related causes, not across the country's history, not across the decade of the crisis, since the beginning of this story. The unofficial mortality estimate of 100 to 130 deaths per day works out to one death approximately every 11 minutes. The story has been running longer than 11 minutes. The story has been running for 2 hours. The Islamic Republic of Iran has executed more than 10,000 people for drug offences since 1979. The number of addicts has increased every single decade. The poppy that was banned in the revolution's first year now grows in Iranian soil. The supply chain that was supposed to be interdicted moves through infrastructure that the state controls. The treatment system that the world praised has not reduced the number of people who need it. Darish Mohammadi's appointment card sits on a kitchen table in southern Isfahan. It has a date on it, 2 weeks from Thursday. Whether he makes that appointment is not a question this story can answer. It is a question that depends on the bus running, on the transport card being renewed, on Nasreen being reachable when the Thursday that felt manageable becomes a Thursday that doesn't, on the clinic having staff and methadone, and the yellow waiting room being open when he arrives. It depends on variables that no policy document governs and no international praise measures and no execution has ever affected. Somewhere in Sistan, Baluchistan, a field is flowering. The flowers are white and pale pink, and they open in the morning light with a particular delicacy of something that doesn't look like what it is, something that, to a person who didn't know, would simply look like a field in bloom, ordinary and seasonal and indifferent to everything that happens after the harvest. The story of how Iran became the world's most opioid-saturated nation is not over. It is not approaching resolution. It is, by every available metric, in the middle of a phase that has no clear end, a phase in which the supply has moved from foreign soil to domestic, in which the infrastructure is deeper than any previous decade, in which the treatment system helps without healing, in which the executions continue without deterring, in which the classified reports have been replaced by published ones that generate summoned meetings and no policy change. The pre-dawn market in Mashhad will be there tomorrow, and the morning after. In the shadow of the golden dome that catches the first light before anything else in the city does, before the buses run, before the clinics open, before appointment cards become relevant. The market will be there. It has never not been there. And somewhere in the mathematics of 11 minutes the count continues,